He ruled everything, and she cleaned his floors. Alpha King Darius Blackthorne had crushed 3 rebellions before his 30th year, had broken men twice his size with nothing but his hands and his silence. Every alpha in the realm bent the knee or buried their dead. That was the order of the world, and nobody questioned it. Then a servant girl walked into the grand hall of the autumn gathering, dirt under her nails, second-hand boots, eyes that wouldn't quite look down the way they were supposed to. And something in the room shifted. Nobody could explain it. Nobody wanted to. Drop your city in the comments. Stay until the end. This one is going to change everything you thought you knew about power. Peace. The morning of the autumn gathering, the capital city of Ironmere smelled like ambition and old blood. That was how Lyra Vale would remember it later. Not the silk banners that hung from every tower, not the polished armor of the Alpha King's personal guard, not the hundreds of wolves who had traveled weeks through Mountain Pass and River Valley to attend. She would remember the smell, the way power had a particular rot to it when concentrated in one place, like meat left too long in warm air, sweet on the surface and wrong underneath. She carried a wooden crate through the servants' passage behind the kitchens, her arms already burning from 3 hours of similar loads. The crate held pressed linens for the East Banquet Wing. Her back had a bruise along the left shoulder blade from where a senior steward named Hollis had shoved her into a doorframe 2 days ago for walking too slow. The bruise had gone purple-green at the center. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. Lyra Vale had been at the Ironmere capital for 43 days. She had come from the Ashfin borderlands, traveling with a supply wagon after her home settlement was absorbed into the royal territory following the death of its alpha. That was what happened to border settlements. They were absorbed, and the people in them were reclassified. Her former alpha had been a quiet man who ran a fair community. The royal adjudicators had declared him insufficiently loyal to the crown and stripped the settlement of its autonomous status. The alpha himself had been sent to a labor camp in the northern mines. Lyra did not know if he was still alive. She didn't know if wondering about it helped anything. What she knew was the weight of the crate, the dimensions of the servants' corridor, the fact that the East Banquet Wing's linen cabinet had a warped lower shelf that wouldn't fully close unless you pushed from the bottom corner at the right angle. She knew how to be invisible. That was the skill that kept a woman like her breathing. The Grand Hall of the Autumn Gathering occupied the entire center of Ironmere's royal complex, a vaulted space built from black granite and pale amber stone, its ceiling rising 40 feet above the main floor. Every 5 years, the Alpha King summoned the pack leaders of the realm to this hall. Every pack of significant size sent its leader, and those leaders brought their most trusted lieutenants, their strongest warriors, their sharpest political allies. The Autumn Gathering was where alliances were confirmed, where territorial disputes were adjudicated, where power was performed for an audience of the most powerful wolves alive. This year's gathering was the largest in 3 decades. Lyra heard it before she saw it. The accumulated sound of several hundred dominant wolves in close proximity, a low-layered tension under the noise of conversation that made the air feel pressurized, like something about to crack. She wasn't supposed to enter the hall itself. Her task was the east wing, the side corridors, the preparation rooms, but the warped linen cabinet was 20 feet inside a side door of the main hall, accessible through an arch that the banquet staff used during formal events, and she had to walk through that arch to reach it. She did it fast. Head down, eyes on the floor, crate in both arms. She made it 6 steps inside before she heard someone say her name. Not her name. Not Lyra. Not Lyra Vale. The designation. "You, Borderlands girl, stop." She stopped. The man who had spoken was standing near a group of 4 others, all of them alpha ranked. She could tell by the weight of their presence, the particular density that dominant wolves carried around them like a second body. This one was broad through the chest, black hair cut close to his skull, wearing the deep crimson and silver that marked the Thornwall pack from the western ridgelines. His name, she would learn later, was Aldrich Greaves, and he was one of Darius Blackthorne's 6 sworn alpha lords. "That crate," he said, "it's crooked. You're about to drop the whole thing on the floor." She adjusted her grip. She hadn't been about to drop it, but she said nothing. "That's the Ashfin girl," said one of the others, a leaner man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "Came in with the last supply intake. She's kitchen ranked." Kitchen ranked. Greaves repeated, the way a man repeats something he finds mildly funny. And she's handling linens for the East Hall. The steward rotation is short, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I was reassigned this morning. Greaves looked at her for a moment, not the way a man looks at a person, the way a man looks at an object he's trying to categorize. Put the crate down, he said. I have a cabinet assignment. Put it down. She set the crate on the floor. He walked toward her slowly. The 4 other men watched. Greaves stopped 3 feet away and studied her face the way she'd seen buyers study livestock at the border markets. She held still, her shoulder throbbed where the bruise was. She breathed through her nose, slow and even, and kept her eyes at the level of his chest, because meeting his gaze directly would be a challenge she couldn't afford, but looking at the floor would give him something to enjoy. You're the one Hollis wrote up, he said, for disrupting the morning allocation. I was late returning a cart. The wheel stuck on a cobblestone seam. Hollis says you argued with him. I explained what happened. That's the same thing. Where you come from? She said nothing. Greaves tilted his head slightly. Ashfin wolves, he said, to no one in particular. They come in thinking border manners transfer, like the realm's rules are the same everywhere. He looked back at her. They're not. You understand? Yes. You say yes, Lord Alpha, to a ranked male in this hall. The hall was full of noise. Nobody nearby was paying attention. This was a small cruelty, too small to draw notice, too specific to be accidental. Lyra knew the shape of it. She had seen it before, in the supply wagon, in the Ashfin settlement in its last weeks, in every place where power had started to curdle, and the men who held it needed to reassure themselves it was still real. Yes, Lord Alpha, she said. Greaves looked at her for another moment. Then he turned away back to his group and picked up whatever conversation she had interrupted. She picked up the crate. She walked to the cabinet. She loaded the linens. She got the lower shelf closed on the second try. She walked out of the hall and did not let herself feel anything about what had just happened until she was back in the servants' corridor, and then she only let herself feel it for a count of 5 breaths, and then she stopped. That was the skill. That was how you survived. Alpha King Darius Blackthorne arrived at the Grand Hall 2 hours before the formal opening of the gathering. He did not arrive the way other men arrived, with a retinue that announced itself, with the noise of approach. He came through the private north entrance, accompanied by only 4 personal guards and his head of council, a gray-haired wolf named Petra Solvang, who had served 3 Alpha Kings before him, and who ran the day-to-day operations of the realm with the efficiency of a woman who had stopped being surprised by anything. Petra was talking as they walked. She was always talking. Darius listened to approximately 60% of what she said and filled in the rest from context. The Cold Fen delegation is already requesting a private audience before the opening ceremony, she was saying. Margrave Essen has a territorial claim against the Dunmore Pack. It's the same Northern Valley dispute that's been cycling through adjudication for 4 years. Deny it, Darius said. He'll take that as a signal that you're favoring Dunmore. Good. Essen's been stalling on the Eastern Wall levy for 6 months. Let him worry. Petra made a note. The Ashfin border absorption is also on the secondary agenda. Several mid-tier pack leaders want reassurance about the absorption protocol. They're worried it's a precedent. It is a precedent. Yes, they'd like to know the criteria. The criteria, Darius said, is that I decide. He paused at the edge of the hall's central floor and stood there for a moment, looking at the space. The banners were correct. The seating arrangement was correct. The lighting was exactly as he had specified. The main chandeliers dimmed, the floor-level torches lit, which created a particular quality of shadow that he found useful during formal proceedings. It made the faces of men harder to read. Made his own face harder to read. Who else is requesting audience? 14 alphas at current count. The more substantive ones include, after the opening ceremony. All of them. You'll need the full night. Then I'll need the full night. He was 37 years old, and he had held the throne of the werewolf realm for 11 years, assuming power at 26 when his father died during a border conflict that Darius had ended within 18 months by methods that nobody talked about in polite company anymore. He was 6'4", built like a man who had spent most of his adolescence learning how to hurt people efficiently, with a face that had taken enough damage over the years to look lived in rather than handsome, a jaw that had been broken once and reset slightly wrong, eyes so dark they registered as black in most lighting. He was feared. He understood that. He had built it deliberately, the same way a man builds a wall, stone by stone, incident by incident, until the structure was solid enough that he didn't have to maintain it constantly anymore. Fear was infrastructure. Fear meant that when he walked into a room, the decision-making of every wolf in that room changed before he had said a single word. Fear was more efficient than respect and more durable than love. He had never particularly wanted to be loved. He looked at his own hall, the banners, the stone, the amber light, and felt the thing he always felt in this space. Not pride. Pride was too soft a word for it. Something harder. Something closer to ownership in its purest form. This was his. He had taken it, and he had kept it, and he would keep it until something stronger than him took it away. He was not particularly worried about that last part. "The borderlands intake," he said to Petra, not quite turning toward her. "How many from the Ashfin absorption?" 14 workers, mostly kitchen and maintenance grade. One is listed with some basic herbal training. She's been provisionally assigned to the infirmary rotation. Any trouble? One minor incident. A senior steward wrote up one of the women for attitude during a work correction. Nothing significant. Darius turned toward the hall. Keep them out of the main proceedings. I don't want border workers in sight during the formal sessions. Understood. Lyra spent the first formal day of the autumn gathering in the lower kitchens, moving between prep stations and storage rooms, carrying things that needed to be carried. The gathered pack leaders ate 3 formal meals, each of which required a different configuration of the banquet arrangements. And the kitchen staff was working at capacity from before dawn until after midnight. She was tired in the way that had stopped being acute and become ambient. A background condition, like the altitude sickness she'd had for the first 2 weeks in the capital, before her body had quietly accepted the new circumstances and adapted without being asked. Tiredness was like that. At a certain point, it just became the weather. What she couldn't adapt away was the dreaming. It had started 11 days ago. She would fall asleep on her narrow cot in the women's dormitory, a converted storage room off the lower kitchen corridor, 8 cots in 2 rows, no window. And the dreams would come immediately, without the usual slow descent. They were not nightmares. She didn't have a word for what they were, exactly. They felt less like dreams than like memories that didn't belong to her. Landscapes she had never seen. Stone architecture older than anything built in the current era. Voices speaking in a dialect of the old tongue that she had only ever seen in a handful of written fragments that the Ashfin settlement's former alpha had kept in a locked chest. She had never told anyone about the chest. The alpha, his name was Caden Weir, had shown it to her 3 years ago, on a morning when the rest of the settlement was occupied with a territorial survey. He had unlocked it with a key he wore against his skin and pulled out a dozen sheets of old parchment covered in writing that she couldn't read, and a few crude illustrations she couldn't interpret, and he had looked at her with an expression she still didn't fully understand and said, "If something happens to this settlement, get yourself out before they catalog you. Your name can't be in their system." She hadn't understood what he meant. Now she was cataloged. She was in the system. She was Ashfin Intake Worker 17, kitchen and maintenance grade, assigned to Ironmere Capital for an indefinite term pending pack reassignment. Caden Weir was in the northern mines. She didn't know what he had been trying to tell her. She didn't know why it had felt, in the moment, like something she needed to remember. On the 3rd night of the gathering, she dreamed differently. It wasn't a landscape this time. It was a room, or the suggestion of a room, the walls implied rather than solid, and in the center of the room stood a woman. Or not a woman. Something that wore the form of a woman, but with a weight to it that made Lyra's knees want to buckle even in the dream. The figure had marks on her forearms and along her collarbone, geometric patterns, not tattooed but embedded in the skin, faintly luminous like a coal that hadn't quite gone cold yet. "You're running out of time," the figure said, not in the current tongue, in the old dialect, the one from the parchment fragments. But Lyra understood it perfectly. "For what?" she asked. "To decide who you're going to be before someone else decides for you." She woke up in the dark dormitory with her heart slamming against her sternum and both forearms burning. She pulled back her sleeves in the dark, ran her thumbs along her own skin. Nothing. Smooth. Normal. She lay on her back with her eyes open and listened to the other women sleeping and tried to remember how to breathe at a regular rate. She was still trying when the bell rang for the morning shift. Go. The formal confrontation happened on the fourth day of the gathering, during the midday assembly. Lyra was not supposed to be in the main hall. She had been sent by a harried junior steward to retrieve a serving platter that had been left at the wrong station. The kind of errand that happened 6 dozen times a day during large events. A small failure in the logistics chain that needed to be corrected immediately. The platter was on a prep table behind the main banquet line, which was accessible through the same side arch she had used on the first day. She went fast. She found the platter. She was turning to leave. "Hold!" The voice came from Darius Blackthorne. She knew it was him before she turned around, the same way you know when a pressure change means a storm. The entire register of the room shifted when he spoke. Every wolf in the space responded to it, the ones who pretended they hadn't responded most obviously of all. She turned around slowly because turning fast would have looked like flinching. He was standing 20 feet away in the main body of the hall, and he was looking directly at her. He had clearly just finished a conversation with one of the senior Alpha Lords. The man was still at his elbow, though stepping back. Around them, a loose cluster of other pack leaders had fallen into the specific attentive stillness of men who know they're about to watch something. Darius Blackthorne looked at Lyra the way he might look at something that had just appeared on the floor of his hall without explanation. Who authorized a floor worker in the main hall during assembly? Nobody answered immediately. The junior steward who had sent her was somewhere in the kitchen corridor. There was no one present who was going to claim responsibility for her being here. Lyra said, "I was sent to retrieve a platter, sir." The "sir" landed wrong. She heard it a half-second after it left her mouth. Not Lord Alpha, not the proper formal address. Too casual. The kind of slip that happened when your brain was running on the wrong sleep and the wrong amount of food. Darius's gaze didn't change. That was the thing about him up close. His face was almost entirely still, which meant you couldn't read anything in it, which meant you were doing what he intended you to do, which was imagine what was behind it. "A platter," he said. "Yes." "You entered the main assembly floor during a formal gathering of pack leaders to retrieve a platter." "The steward sent me. I was told it was urgent." "No steward has authority to send kitchen workers into assembly during—" He paused. He looked at her more carefully. Not the way Greaves had looked at her, cataloging an object. Something more attentive than that, more specific. "You're from the border intake," he said. "Yes." "Ashvin settlement." "Yes." The cluster of Alpha Lords around him had expanded slightly. She could feel the weight of them at the edge of her awareness. A dozen dominant wolves within 40 feet, most of them ranking above any wolf she had ever been in proximity to before coming to the capital. The pressure of it was physical. It sat on the chest. It made the peripheral vision go slightly strange, like being at high altitude. She held the platter with both hands and did not move. Darius walked toward her. He moved the way powerful men move when they're not in a hurry, like the space belongs to them, and everything in it is simply waiting for them to pass through. He stopped 8 feet away. Close enough that she could see the break in his jaw where it had healed wrong. Close enough to register that he was significantly larger than the average dominant wolf, and that this had not happened by accident. "What's your name?" he said. "Lyra Vale." "Lyra Vale," he repeated. "From the Ashvin borderlands." "Yes." "Caden Weir's settlement." Something shifted in her chest at the name, quiet and fast. She kept it off her face. "Yes." "Weir was a weak alpha," Darius said conversationally. Not to her, to the room, to the assembled pack leaders who were watching. He ran a settlement of 200 wolves on the eastern border and couldn't hold his own levy commitments for 3 consecutive cycles. A pack leader who can't meet his obligations to the crown is a liability. Absorbing the territory was necessary. He looked back at Lyra. "You understand that?" It wasn't a question. The tone of it made that clear. The question wasn't whether she understood. The question was whether she was going to perform understanding correctly, right now, in front of everyone. She thought of Caden Weir with his locked chest and his key worn against his skin. She thought of him saying, "Get yourself out before they catalog you." She thought of what it meant that she was currently cataloged. "Yes," she said. Darius studied her. "You don't look like you mean that." "I do." "You're standing in the middle of my formal assembly holding a platter and looking at me like you have an opinion about my policy decisions." The hall was quiet. Not silent. There was still background noise from the kitchen passages, still the distant sounds of a large building in operation. But the cluster of wolves around them had gone very still. The specific stillness of men who have decided to watch something and have silently agreed among themselves to make space for it. "I don't have an opinion about your policy decisions," Lyra said. "No. I'm a kitchen worker." "Then act like one." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you know what the problem with Ashfin wolves is?" She didn't answer. "They come from settlements where the alpha was too soft to teach them how things actually work. They come in here thinking that because they're standing upright and speaking in full sentences, they have a position. They don't." He looked at the platter in her hands. "That's your position. Understood?" Every eye in the hall on her, the bruise on her shoulder blade, the tiredness in her bones, the 8 cots in the converted storage room, the northern mines somewhere beyond the mountain passes, the burning in her forearms that had started in the dream and hadn't fully gone away since. "Understood," she said. Darius held her gaze for another moment. Then something happened in his expression. Not softening, not anger. Something more like surprise, almost. The way a man looks when something he expected to break hasn't broken yet, and he isn't sure why. He covered it fast. She wasn't sure anyone else saw it. "Get out of my hall," he said. She got out. She walked through the side arch and into the servants' corridor, and she went 40 feet down the corridor, and then she put the platter down against the wall very carefully, and she stood with her back against the stone, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, and they were shaking, and she could feel the vibration going up through her forearms, which were burning again. The same sensation as the dream, the same current under the skin. She pushed her sleeves up. Still nothing visible. But the burning was real. It was getting harder to write off as nerves or exhaustion. From further down the corridor came a voice. One of the younger kitchen staff, a girl named Desh, who was 16 and had been at the capital her whole life, and who treated Lyra with the particular wariness of someone who didn't know which category to put her in. "Vale, you okay?" "Fine," Lyra said. She pulled her sleeves down. "I dropped the platter. I need a cloth." "You dropped it?" It slipped. Desh came around the corner and looked at Lyra and then at the platter, which was on the floor but intact. She looked at Lyra's face. "What happened in there?" "Nothing." "I heard he—" "Nothing happened," Lyra said. "It was nothing. Where's the cloth rack?" Desh pointed. Lyra went and got a cloth. She picked up the platter. She went back to work. That night, the burning in her forearms didn't stop. She lay on her cot and watched the dark and felt it. Not painful exactly, but insistent, like something trying to get out from inside. The dormitory breathed around her, the other women sleeping. Desh had the cot 2 down from hers. The woman on her immediate left was named Senna, from a Western pack that had been absorbed 2 years prior, who kept her past in a locked box the same way Lyra did. Lyra rolled up her left sleeve in the dark and held her forearm close to her face, trying to see it in the minimal light from the gap under the door. The marks were faint. So faint she almost convinced herself they weren't there. Thin lines at the inner forearm, geometric, like something drawn with a very fine tool, but not drawn. She could feel that they were in the skin, not on it. She pressed her thumb against them. They didn't smear, they didn't hurt when she pressed. They pulsed once, very faintly, like a response. She pressed her arm flat against the mattress and breathed. She thought about the woman in the dream, the figure, the form, whatever it was. She thought about the way it had looked at her, which was not the way anyone else looked at her. Not Greaves with his cataloging inspection, not Darius with his performance of authority. The figure in the dream had looked at her the way you look at something you recognize after a long time away. She thought about Caden Weir's locked chest. She thought about the word, "get yourself out," and the word catalog, and the 11 days between her arrival at the capital and the start of the dreams. She thought about the way Darius had looked at her for that one fraction of a second, the look that wasn't anger, wasn't contempt, the look that was something else, something that had been there and been covered very fast. He had recognized something. She didn't know what. She wasn't sure he did either. In the corridor outside the dormitory, 2 of the Alpha King's guards walked their regular circuit, boots on stone, unhurried. She could hear them. She could hear, further away, the main hall still in use. The gathering ran late sessions that went well past midnight, formal negotiations behind closed doors. She lay on her cot in the dark with ancient marks burning low and slow on her forearms. The world as she understood it had 43 days left to it. She didn't know that yet. On the 5th morning, before the kitchen bell rang, she woke from a dream so vivid that for a full 15 seconds she did not know which reality was real. In the dream, she had been standing in the main hall of the gathering, not as a kitchen worker with a platter. Standing in the center of the floor, all eyes on her, but not the way they had been the day before. Not the attention of men watching something small and easily dismissed. The other kind. The kind that happens when something large moves. The alphas in the room had been kneeling. All of them. Darius Blackthorne had been the last one standing, and his face, in the dream, she had finally seen what was behind the stillness. She had finally seen what he kept back there, and it was the thing she least expected from a man who ruled an entire world with fear. He was afraid. She came back to full wakefulness and lay there with that image behind her eyes. Darius Blackthorne's face cracking open. The thing inside it. The marks on her forearms were blazing, and from somewhere in the building, somewhere in the complex, somewhere she couldn't pinpoint, she heard a sound that was not a sound so much as a frequency, the way a very deep note on a very large instrument reverberates not in your ears but in your chest, in your teeth, in the marrow. She sat up. Desh was already awake, sitting upright on her cot, eyes wide in the dark. 2 other women were stirring. They all felt it, not the same way she did. She could see in their faces that it was a background sensation for them, unplaceable, just vaguely wrong. For Lyra, it was a summons. She pulled on her boots. "Where are you going?" Desh whispered. She didn't have an answer for that. She went. The corridor was dark at this hour. The torches burned low, and she moved through it by memory, by the 43 days of routes she had walked until they were in her body. She climbed 2 staircases. She passed through the eastern passage near the linen storage. She went without thinking about where she was going, following the frequency the way you follow a sound you're not sure is real. She came to a stop in an alcove off the north passage of the main hall, and she saw it. Not the hall itself. The door to the private archive level was open, just barely, 6 inches of dark showing past the iron-banded frame. The archive level was below the main hall, accessible through a staircase that was always locked. Always. She had walked past this door 30 times in 6 weeks, and it had never been anything but closed and sealed. It was open. The frequency was coming from below. She stood in the alcove and looked at the open door and felt her whole body go completely still, in a way that had nothing to do with hiding and everything to do with what happens when a living thing understands, on some level below language, that the thing it is looking at will change everything. She put her hand on the door. She pushed it open. The stairs went down. She followed them. The archive level was cold and smelled like stone and dry parchment and something older than either. The particular smell of things that have existed so long they have stopped belonging to the present entirely. The space was not lit by torches. The light came from the objects themselves. She saw them as she reached the bottom of the stairs. A series of glass-fronted cases along the far wall, inside which sat documents, sealed vessels, fragments of materials she couldn't name. And in the center of the room, on a heavy stone table, a single open volume roughly the size of a large map, its pages so old that the material was closer to skin than paper. The marks on her forearms were blazing. She looked down at them in the light from the cases, and they were visible, faintly but unmistakably. The lines she had tried to convince herself she wasn't seeing. She crossed the room to the stone table. The open volume was written in the old dialect, but she could read it. She could read all of it instantly, without effort, the same way she had understood the figure in the dream, comprehension arriving fully formed, as if the language had always been there, and she had simply stopped pretending it wasn't. She read. And what she read was a history that had been removed from the official record so thoroughly that not even a rumor of it remained in living memory. A history of a bloodline that predated the Alpha Kings, that had, in fact, existed before the concept of the Alpha King had been codified at all. A bloodline called sovereign. Not a political title, a biological reality. A genetic line that carried a different relationship to the wolf nature. Not dominance as hierarchy, not power as performance, but something that the text described in a word she didn't have a clean modern translation for. The closest she could get was authority, but that wasn't quite it. The word was older and cleaner than that. The text said, "The sovereign does not rule. The sovereign is what ruling descends from." She read for 3 hours. She did not feel the cold or the time passing. By the time the kitchen bell rang, somewhere above her in the building, she had read enough to understand 3 things. The first was what the marks on her forearms were. The second was why Caden Weir had told her to keep herself out of the system. The third was why Darius Blackthorne's eyes had gone the way they had gone when he looked at her in the hall. He had felt it before he had understood it. The instinctive response that the Alpha Kings, according to the text, had been attempting to suppress and override in themselves for 700 years. The particular recognition that fired in dominant wolves when they were in proximity to a sovereign bloodline. Not fear of arrival. Something closer to the response of a subordinate wolf in the presence of a true pack authority. Involuntary, unwanted, humiliating to a man who had built his entire identity on being the thing that nothing above him existed to challenge. She closed the volume with both hands. She looked at her forearms. The marks were fully visible now, clear and sharp in the cold light. Not faint at all. Not something she could convince herself she wasn't seeing. She heard boots on the stairs. She turned. Darius Blackthorne stood at the bottom of the archive staircase, in what appeared to be the same clothes he had been wearing the previous day. And by the look of him, he had been in the main hall all night running negotiations, and had come down here either because he had seen the light, or because something had drawn him here the same way it had drawn her. His 4 personal guards were not with him. He was alone. He looked at her forearms. She watched his face do the thing he didn't want it to do. "How did you get in here?" he said. His voice was completely controlled. The question was not. "The door was open." "That's not possible." "I know." He crossed the room toward her in 4 strides. Not slowly, not performing anything, moving the way he must have moved in the border conflicts that nobody talked about in polite company anymore, with the efficiency of a man who had trained his body to act faster than his doubts. He stopped 5 feet away and looked at the marks on her forearms and the open volume on the stone table behind her, and she watched him take in what he was looking at and make the connections, and she watched the stillness in his face become something different, harder, more focused, the kind of focus that precedes a decision. "Shut your sleeves," he said. "Why?" He looked at her. "Because if my guards see those marks on your skin, there's a chain of events that starts that I can't stop." She didn't move. "Who sent you here?" he said. "No one." "Someone accessed this archive. Someone opened that door." "I told you, it was open." "Locks don't open themselves." "Apparently they do," she said. "For me." The silence between them was not like the silence in the hall the day before. The silence in the hall had been a performance. His authority, her endurance, the audience watching both. This was something else. This was 2 people standing in an underground room with no audience, and something on the table between them that had just changed every single rule either of them was operating by. Darius looked at the volume. He looked at her forearms. He looked at her face. "How much of that did you read?" he said quietly. "All of it." He was silent for a moment. Then, "You understand what's in there?" "Yes?" "You understand what it means?" She met his eyes directly. She didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" And she watched something move across his face that she had seen once before, that fraction of a second in the main hall before he covered it. The thing behind the stillness. The thing a man builds walls around for 11 years because walls are more reliable than the alternative. He was afraid. But this time she saw something else underneath the fear, something that looked, against all logic, like relief. "Close your sleeves," he said one more time. His voice was lower now, stripped of the performance. "And don't come back to this room." He paused. "They're going to come for you, not today, but they're going to find out, and when they do, I won't be able to stop it." He turned away. He walked to the stairs. "Lord Alpha," she said. He stopped. She looked at the marks on her own forearms, luminous, geometric, clear as print on clean paper. "You're already too late," she said. From above, through the stone and the floor, came the sound of boots. Multiple sets, moving fast. Not the regular circuit. Moving with direction, with purpose. Moving toward the private archive staircase. Someone had seen the light. The boots hit the stone of the upper staircase and Darius moved. Not toward the stairs. Toward her. He crossed the archive floor in 3 strides, grabbed the volume off the stone table with one hand and her left wrist with the other, and pulled her toward the far wall of the archive where the shelving ran deepest. A recess behind the glass-fronted cases. Narrow, dark, the kind of space that existed in old buildings because old buildings were built by people who understood that you sometimes needed to disappear inside your own walls. She didn't fight him. Not because she couldn't, because she was processing too fast to waste energy on reflex. He pushed her back into the recess, stepped in front of her, and pulled the volume against his chest. In the dark, she could see the side of his face, the jaw, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate steadying of his breathing that told her he was running the same calculation she was. How many guards? How fast? What they'd seen? What could still be managed? The door at the top of the stairs opened. Boots on the steps. 2 sets. Then a third. "My lord," the voice belonged to one of the senior guard captains, a wolf named Carrick, whom Lyra had seen twice in corridor rotations and learned to step around. "We saw light from the lower passage. The archive door was standing open." Darius stepped out of the recess into the archive floor. Lyra stayed where she was, back against the stone, not breathing. "I opened it," Darius said. His voice had gone back to what it was in the hall, flat, complete, a voice that didn't ask for anything. "I wanted to pull a reference for the Cold Fen territorial records. We're running the Northern Valley adjudication at 2nd session." A pause. Lyra could hear Carrick's boots on the bottom steps, the slight hesitation of a man trying to reconcile what he'd been told with what his instincts were registering. "Should I send for the archive steward, my lord? The records access protocol?" "I am the protocol," Darius said. "Get back to your post." Another pause. Shorter. "Yes, my lord." Boots on the stairs going up, the door at the top closing. Silence. Darius stood in the center of the archive floor and did not turn around for a long moment. Lyra stayed in the recess and watched his back and thought about what he had just done. Not the lying. The lying was simple, reflexive, the kind of cover a man with 11 years of political survival performs without effort. What she was thinking about was the direction of it. He had covered for her. He had put himself in the story, made himself the reason the light was on and the door was open, and in doing so had made it impossible to question her presence here without questioning him. She didn't know what to do with that yet, so she filed it and moved forward. "You should go," he said, still not turning. "You could have handed me to them." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He turned around then. He was holding the volume against his chest, and his face was doing the thing it had done twice now, trying to be still, not quite making it. "Because what's in that book doesn't exist until it does, and once it does, I can't control what happens." "You think you can control it now?" "I think there's still a window where I can manage it." He looked at her forearms, which she had pulled her sleeves down over. "How visible are they in full light?" "Clear," she said. "They weren't visible yesterday." "They're accelerating." He said it like a man reading a map, tracking the rate of travel, calculating distance remaining. "Which means we have less time than I thought." "Time for what?" "Time for me to figure out what in the hell I'm going to do with you." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to do something with me. Someone in this gathering is going to see those marks. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But this hall has 300 wolves in it, Lyra, and half of them have old blood. And old blood recognizes old blood whether the people carrying it want it to or not. He set the volume down on the stone table, not gently. When they see those marks, they're going to react. And when they react in front of each other, there's no putting it back. She thought about the text she had read, the 700 years of suppression, the deliberate erasure, the Alpha Kings who had systematically removed every record that might suggest there was something above them in the hierarchy of the wolf nature. "You've read this before," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "You've read this before," she said again. "You knew what was in here. That's why you came down." "I came down because I saw the light." "You came down because you felt it. The same way I felt it. The same way you felt it in the hall yesterday when you looked at me." She watched his face. "That's what it does, isn't it? That's what the text describes. The involuntary recognition. You've been feeling it for days and you came down here to find out if what you were feeling was what you thought it was." The silence between them had weight in it. "Yes," he said finally. One word, stripped clean. "And? And it's exactly what I thought it was." He looked at her, and for the first time he looked at her without any of the layers, without the hall performance, without the political calculation, with nothing in front of whatever was actually in his face. "Which means, I have a problem. You have a problem. A significant one." She pulled her left sleeve up and held her forearm out between them. The marks were clear in the archive light, steady and geometric, and deeply embedded in her skin. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at him. "No," she said. "I have a bloodline. You have a problem." She went back to the kitchen. There was nothing else to do. She went back through the corridor, through the eastern passage, down the service stairs, and into the noise and heat of the lower kitchen where the morning shift was already in full operation, and nobody had time to ask where she'd been because 3 of the prep stations were running behind on the first session's breakfast service. She took her position at the bread station and worked. Her hands moved without requiring much from her brain, which was good because her brain was somewhere else entirely. The marks had been visible in the archive. They were not visible now. She had checked, in a gap between tasks, pulling her sleeve up in the corner behind the flour storage. Faint again, barely traceable. But the burning was constant, a low current that had settled in as background the way the tiredness had settled in, the way the altitude had settled in. Her body was doing something. She didn't fully understand what yet. What she understood was that the archive text had described it as progressive, the awakening, the text had called it, using a word that was neutral in the old dialect, biological rather than dramatic, the way you'd describe a plant reaching toward light. Not a choice, a process. Desh appeared at her elbow during the mid-morning lull. "You disappeared this morning." "I couldn't sleep, I walked." "Before the bell?" "Yeah." Desh looked at her. The girl was 16 and not stupid, which was a combination that was either going to keep her alive or get her into trouble, and Lyra hadn't yet determined which. "Carrick's unit did a sweep of the North Passage at dawn," she said, keeping her voice low. "Senna heard them. Standard circuit." Senna said it wasn't the standard circuit. It was directed, like they were looking for something. Lyra kept working. "Lots of pack leaders in the building. Increased security during gathering is normal." Desh was quiet for a moment. "Vale, are you okay?" "I'm fine." "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days." "I haven't slept well in 11 days. It's not new." She handed Desh a load of clean towels from the rack. "Take those to the East Prep Station. They're low." Desh took the towels. She went. She looked back once. Oh. The second formal session of the gathering began at midday. Lyra heard it from the kitchens. The change in the building's ambient sound when 300 dominant wolves moved from informal circulation to structured assembly. The pressure of it changed too, more concentrated, more directional. She was carrying a supply tray through the third-floor service corridor at the moment she first heard the other Alpha's voice, and she stopped. The voice was coming from behind a closed door, a private meeting room off the main corridor used for small group negotiations. She knew this corridor. She had cleaned it. The door was thick and the voices inside were intended to be private, but she was close enough, and her hearing had been doing something odd since the marks had started, sharpening in ways she kept noticing and not fully accounting for. Two voices, one she didn't know, one she did. The unknown voice said, "She's from the Ashvin intake, kitchen grade. Nobody." Darius's voice said, "Then stop talking about her." "You were seen, my lord, in the hall. Yesterday. The way you looked at her." Greaves noticed. Essen noticed. Greaves notices everything he thinks might be useful to him. That's why I don't trust him with anything that is. This isn't about Greaves. This is about what they saw. A pause. There's something off about that woman. Carrick's unit felt it in the North Passage last night. They didn't know what they were feeling, but 3 trained wolves and they all registered something in the lower level that they can't explain. Old buildings have old air. They were reacting to the archive. "Darius," the voice shifted, dropped the formal register, became something more direct. "I've known you for 15 years. I know what your face looks like when you're managing something. You're managing something." Silence. "Her name is Lyra Vale," Darius said. "She's a border worker. She made it into the hall during assembly because a steward sent her on an errand without checking the access protocol. I addressed it. It's done." "And the North Passage last night?" "I told Carrick. I was in the archive. At that hour. I don't sleep as much as you do, Petra." Lyra stood in the corridor with her supply tray and her spine very straight and her breathing very deliberate, and she filed the name Petra into the slot where it belonged and understood that the gray-haired woman who ran the practical operations of the realm had been in that meeting room and had said, "I've known you for 15 years, and had said you're managing something, and had been right on all 3 counts. Petra Solvang was not someone she could afford to be underestimated by. She walked on. The afternoon went wrong at the 3rd hour of the 2nd session. Lyra was in the East Service corridor when she heard it. Not words, not yet, just the shift in the hall's collective register that meant something unscripted was happening. She had been in enough pressured environments to know the difference between the noise of 300 wolves going through planned proceedings and the noise of 300 wolves responding to something unexpected. The second was faster, more layered. It had a particular texture to it, like a crowd all turning their heads at once. She stopped walking. From the far end of the service corridor, through the banquet arch, she could see a sliver of the main hall. A narrow vertical strip, enough to register movement, enough to see that the formal seating arrangement had shifted, that wolves were standing who should have been seated. She moved toward the arch. She should not have moved toward the arch. She knew that. She moved anyway, because whatever was happening in that hall was pulling at her the same way the archive door had pulled at her in the dark. Not impulse, not curiosity. Something more baseline than that. Something that operated below the level of choice. She reached the edge of the arch. The man standing in the center of the hall floor was someone she had never seen before. Alpha ranked. She felt that before she fully registered his appearance, but carrying it differently than the wolves she'd been exposed to. Differently than Greaves. Differently than the Thornwall Lord. Differently than Darius. This was a wolf who was dominant the way mountain ranges are dominant, without effort or performance, simply by existing at a certain scale. He was tall, dark-complexioned, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was more intimidating than motion. He wore the deep black and copper of a territory she couldn't immediately identify. Eastern, her mind said, far Eastern. And then she remembered the archive text mentioning the Eastern bloodlines, the ones that carried the oldest wolf genetics, the ones that the early sovereign histories had described as the most sensitive to. He turned and looked directly at her. Across the full length of the main hall, through a crowd of 300 wolves, he turned and looked directly at her, and she understood that he had known she was there before she knew she was there. He was not the only one looking. 3 other wolves in the hall had turned in the same moment, pulled by the same invisible signal, all of them looking at the east arch where she stood with her supply tray and her servant's clothes and her sleeves pushed down over her forearms. Darius was on his feet. She saw him register what was happening, saw him look at the Eastern Alpha, look at the 3 others, look at her, and in the compression of a second, understand exactly what she had understood a moment before. The recognition was firing in the hall, not in everyone, in the oldest blood, in the wolves whose genetics were close enough to the original lines that the suppression was never quite complete. "Close the east arch," Darius said. Not loud, not an order that was meant to carry. It was meant for his immediate guard, and it did carry, and two of them moved toward her position. She stepped back from the arch. She turned and walked back down the service corridor at the same pace she always walked, because running would be heard and noted, and running was the one thing she absolutely could not do right now. And she walked until she hit the corner and turned it, and then she pressed herself against the stone wall and felt her forearms blazing through her sleeves, and felt her own heartbeat doing something it had never done before. Not faster, exactly, but deeper, like it had found a lower gear, like it was drawing on something she hadn't previously had access to. From the hall, muffled through the stone in the distance, she heard the Eastern Alpha's voice say, "Where did she go?" And Darius's voice, flat and controlled and managing something, say, "Who?" The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to establish that the Eastern Alpha was not a man who was fooled by that kind of deflection, and was choosing, for reasons of his own, to allow it for now. "My Lord Blackthorne," the Eastern Alpha said, "we should speak privately, at your earliest convenience." The emphasis on earliest was not subtle. Baaseb. His name was Evander Kyle, and he held the eastern territory of Valehurst, a region the size of 4 combined standard territories, running from the Iron Coast to the mountain spine, governed by a bloodline that had been at the gathering for the first time in 12 years because the previous holder of the Valehurst seat had refused every summons Darius had issued, and Darius had not pressed it, for reasons that the assembled pack leaders had always found interesting and never fully understood. Lyra found this out from Desh 2 hours later, who had found it out from one of the kitchen workers who had been serving at the Valehurst table. He came in with 6 of his own guard and wouldn't let the Capitol security anywhere near them, Desh said, keeping her voice below the kitchen noise. And during the second session, he just stood up, mid-proceedings. Nobody does that. What did he say? Nobody outside the hall could hear, but Senna's cousin is on the east serving line, and she said the whole room went tight the second he stood up, and then he looked at the east arch and the room went tighter. Desh looked at her. Senna's cousin said he was looking at someone in the arch. Lyra said nothing. Vale. I was in the east corridor during second session. I passed the arch. She said he looked like he'd been hit. The burn in her forearms was steady and deep. She thought about Evander Kale's stillness across the length of the hall. She thought about the 3 other wolves who had turned at the same moment. She thought about what the archive text had said about the recognition, involuntary, instinctive, the genetic equivalent of a compass needle responding to north. "Finish the tray," she said to Desh. "The east table needs their bread service." Desh stared at her for a moment. Then she took the tray and went. Darius found her at dusk, not sought her out. She understood the distinction. He had not sent someone to locate her and bring her to him. He had come himself, without guards, through the service passage that ran parallel to the women's dormitory corridor, and he found her there because she had been waiting, because she had understood from the moment in the hall that the day was not finished with them yet. He was tired. She could see it, not the kind of tired that came from a long day, the kind that came from a long day on top of 11 years, and the weight of something that had just shifted under him without warning. His face was doing the managed stillness, but it was costing him more than it had in the morning. "Kale wants a private audience," he said. No preamble. "I know. You know what he is. I read the archive. The Eastern bloodlines carry the oldest wolf genetics. They're more sensitive to the sovereign recognition than any other line in the realm." She looked at him. "He's going to keep pushing for that audience until you give it to him." "I know. And when you do, you're going to have to explain why you're protecting a kitchen worker." He was quiet for a moment. The service passage was narrow, and they were standing closer than they had been in the archive, the space not permitting the distance that the hall had. She could hear his breathing. He was controlling it the same way she was controlling hers. "I'm not protecting you," he said. "I'm protecting the sequence of events. That's the same thing right now." "It won't be." He looked at her forearms. "When Kyle sees those marks, he already knows," she said. "He didn't need to see the marks. The recognition doesn't require visual confirmation. He knows exactly what I am. He's known since he walked into this hall. Then what does he want from a private audience? To find out what you're going to do about it. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a decision being approached. She recognized the quality of it. She had stood at the edge of her own decisions enough times to know what it felt like when someone else was standing at the edge of theirs. I need you to stay invisible for the next 48 hours, Darius said. I don't think I can. Try. Darius. His name landed in the narrow passage and she watched him react to it, the small, involuntary thing that happened in his jaw. She had not used his name before. She had said Sir and Lord Alpha and nothing at all, but she had not used his name. The text described it as progressive. It's been 11 days since it started. It's moving faster now. Your wolves felt it in the North Passage last night without even being in proximity to me. By tomorrow, by the day after, I know what the text says. Then you know that 48 hours doesn't change what happens next. It only changes who's in the room when it happens. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see him doing the calculation she recognized from the archive. Not political calculation, not the management of optics and consequences. The other kind, the one that ran underneath, the one that asked what something cost at the level below strategy. What do you want? He said. The question surprised her. Not the words, the way he said them, without armor, without the layer of performance that had been on everything else he'd said to her. A real question, directed at a real person. She thought about Caden Weir's locked chest, the key worn against his skin, the words "get yourself out," the northern mines, the 43 days and the dreams and the burning and the marks that were now fully embedded in her skin and would be visible in full light tomorrow and the day after and every day after that for the rest of her life. She thought about the archive text, the word that meant authority without a clean modern translation. I want to know why you didn't hand me to your guards this morning, she said. Really? He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because I've spent 11 years holding a realm together with fear, he said. And fear works. It's efficient and it's durable and it doesn't ask anything of you except that you maintain it. But I read that archive 7 years ago, the first time, and I have read it 4 more times since. And every time I read it, I understand that what I built is a structure. And structures have load limits. And I have been standing at the load limit for 2 years. He looked at her. And then you walked into my hall, and every dominant wolf with old blood in their line turned toward you without knowing why. And I felt what they felt. And what I felt wasn't a threat. A pause, and the last of the stillness came off his face. It felt like something I'd been missing the word for. The service passage was very quiet. From the main hall at the far end of the building, she heard movement. Multiple sets of boots, purposeful and converging. Not Carrick's unit, something larger. She looked at Darius. He had heard it too. She could see it in the way his head had lifted, the way his body had reorganized itself toward whatever was coming. How many alphas in this hall have old blood, she said. At least 40, probably more. And right now they're all feeling it. They've been feeling it all day and they don't understand it, and it's been building since this morning, and the only question left is which one of them decides to stop waiting and find out what it is. Darius looked at her. You need to make a decision, she said. Right now. Before those boots reach this corridor. Because after they do, you don't get to make it anymore. Someone else makes it for you, and it gets made the way things get made when 300 dominant wolves are frightened of something they don't understand. The boots were getting louder. He looked at her forearms. He looked at her face. Pull up your sleeves, he said. She stared at him. Pull them up, he said. Both of them. All the way. And she understood then what he was deciding. Not to hide it, not to manage the sequence, not 48 more hours of invisible and careful and staying out of sight. He was deciding the opposite, and she could see in his face the exact weight of it, what it cost, what it meant, what he was trading away, and what he was choosing instead. She pulled her sleeves up. The marks blazed on both forearms, clear and geometric, and completely unmistakable in the narrow light of the service passage. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Evander Kale stepped through it. Behind him, his 6 guards. Behind them, 3 of Darius's alpha lords, Greaves among them, all of them having followed the pull that had been building in this building all day, all of them arriving at this moment in this narrow corridor the way rivers arrive at the sea, not by choice, by the shape of the land. Cale looked at Lyra's forearms. He went to one knee, not slowly, not with deliberation. The way a tree comes down, all at once, the decision made somewhere above the level of conscious choice, the body following before the mind had finished arguing. Behind him, one of his 6 guards went down too, then another. Greaves was in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and she could see the war going on in him. The 11 years of alignment with Darius, the political survival, the infrastructure of fear that he had built his position inside. She could see him fighting it. She could see him losing. He did not kneel, but his hand on the doorframe went white at the knuckles. Lyra stood in the service passage with the marks burning on both forearms and Evander Kael on one knee in front of her, and Darius Blackthorne at her left side. And she understood, with a clarity that felt less like thought and more like the arrival of something that had always been true, that she had just run out of the option of being invisible. The passage was the last private moment this was ever going to be. What came next was going to happen in front of everyone. Greaves did not kneel. That was the thing Lyra kept coming back to in the hours that followed. Not Kael on one knee in the narrow corridor, not the 2 Valehurst guards who had gone down beside him, not the specific quality of Darius's silence while all of it happened around him. She kept coming back to Greaves in the doorframe with his hand white on the wood, and his face doing the war and his knees not moving. A man who could fight the recognition was a man who had decided, before he walked through that door, that whatever he found on the other side of it was something he intended to use. She understood that in the moment. She filed it. She did not act on it fast enough. The immediate hour was managed by Darius with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent 11 years turning crises into controlled burns. He got Kael off the floor, not physically, not with a hand extended, but with 3 sentences delivered in a tone that made standing back up feel like the correct decision. He dismissed the Valehurst guards to the east corridor. He looked at Greaves for exactly 2 seconds and said nothing, which was its own kind of sentence. Then he took Lyra out of the service passage through the north door, up a staircase she hadn't used before, into a private office on the 2nd floor of the residential wing that smelled like old leather and lamp oil, and the particular neutrality of a room that was used for decisions rather than comfort. Kael followed. Darius had not told him to. He had not told him not to. The office had a heavy table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out over the inner courtyard. Darius stood at the window. Kael sat without being invited. Lyra stayed near the door because the door was where she needed to be if this conversation went the wrong direction. "How long have you known she was here?" Darius said. His back was to the room. 6 hours, Kael said. "I felt her before I crossed the main gate." 6 hours. I thought I was wrong. I haven't felt that pull in 20 years, not since my grandfather died and I stopped believing the histories were anything but mythology. He looked at Lyra. Not the way Greaves had looked at her in the hall on the first day. Not cataloging, not dismissing. The other kind of looking, the kind that saw through the servant's clothes and the bruised shoulder and the 43 days of careful invisibility to whatever was underneath. The last confirmed sovereign heir died in the 3rd century. Every history says so. Every history was written by alpha kings, Lyra said, after they'd spent 50 years removing what they didn't want in it. Kael looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I know." Darius turned from the window. "What do you want, Kael?" "The same thing I've wanted for 12 years. A realm that doesn't run on fear." He looked at Darius steadily. "You've held it together. I'll grant you that. Nobody thought you could after your father's disaster in the Eastern campaigns, and you did. But you've held it the wrong way, and we both know it. The border absorptions, the labor camps, the levy system that starves settlements that can't make their numbers." His voice was even, not accusatory. The voice of a man stating facts he's had arranged in his head for a long time. You've kept the structure standing by making everyone inside it afraid of what happens if it falls. That's not governance. That's a hostage situation. "And her?" Darius said, the word her flat and contained. Kael looked at Lyra again. She's not a political solution. You know that. The sovereign bloodline isn't a throne to be installed and managed. The histories that survive describe it as, I've read the same histories, Darius said. Then you understand what happens when it fully awakens. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. The dominant wolves in proximity respond to it at the instinctive level before the conscious level can intervene, and once that happens at scale, he stopped. He looked at Darius with something that was not quite compassion, but was in the neighborhood of it. There's no after for you in that scenario, you understand? The room was very quiet. Lyra looked at Darius's face and saw the thing she had seen twice before. The look that wasn't anger, and wasn't contempt, and wasn't the managed stillness. The look that was underneath all of it. She understood something in that moment that she hadn't fully understood before. He had read the archive 7 years ago and had read it 4 more times since, not because he was trying to find a way to stop it, but because he was trying to find a way to understand what it would mean when it arrived and whether there was any version of it where he came out the other side still himself. He had known this was coming. He had known it since the archive, maybe before, and he had kept governing anyway, kept building the fear infrastructure anyway, kept running the lever system and the border absorptions and the labor camps. Not because he didn't know it was wrong, but because he didn't know what else to do with a realm that had been governed by dominance for 7 centuries and would collapse into factional war the moment the dominance was removed without something solid to replace it. He had been waiting, she realized, for something that could hold the weight. He just hadn't expected it to arrive in second-hand boots with dirt under its nails. "What do you recommend?" Darius said to Kyle. His voice was stripped of everything except the question. "Get her out of this gathering," Kyle said. "Tonight, before Greaves moves." Both of them looked at him. "He didn't kneel," Kale said simply. "In my experience, the wolves who can fight the recognition in a direct confrontation have already decided which side they're on. Greaves has been positioned at your right hand for 6 years. He knows your patterns, your protocols, your guard rotations, your private entrances and exits. He knows where every body is buried, literally and otherwise." He paused. He walked through that door tonight because he wanted to see what was in the corridor. He has seen it. By morning, whoever he reports to will know. "Greaves reports to me," Darius said. "Greaves reports to Greaves," Kyle said. "He always has. You've just been useful to him." But they moved her that night. Not out of the capital. The capital was locked down during gathering. All external gates under guard rotation that Darius himself couldn't alter without raising flags he couldn't explain. But out of the servants' dormitory, out of the kitchen rotation, into a secondary residential room in the north wing that was used for guest overflow and was currently empty. Desh found out anyway. Lyra didn't know how. The girl appeared at the door of the north wing room 2 hours after Lyra had been moved there, with a bundle of Lyra's things from the dormitory cot and an expression that was trying to be neutral and not managing it. "You're not kitchen ranked anymore," Desh said. "I'm still kitchen ranked. You're in the north residential wing. Overflow assignment." Desh set the bundle down inside the door. She looked at Lyra the way she'd been looking at her for 3 days, with the specific frustration of someone who keeps identifying the shape of a thing and keeps being told the shape isn't there. Senna's cousin said Evander Kyle of Valehurst knelt in the service corridor tonight. She said 2 of his guard went down with him. Senna's cousin should watch less and work more. Vale. The girl's voice broke slightly, just at the edge. She pulled it back. "Whatever is happening, I'm not stupid. I've seen the way you move. I've seen you flinch away from the alpha-ranked males and then not flinch when you probably should. I've seen the way the king looked at you in the hall." She stopped. "I just want to know if you're going to be okay." Lyra looked at her for a moment. 16 years old, capital-born. No pack of her own, because the pack she'd been born into had dissolved in a levy dispute when she was 9, and she'd come into the kitchen system through a welfare allocation and had been here since. She knew the building the way Lyra knew the archive, by necessity, by the particular intelligence of someone who understands that knowing your environment is the only leverage available to you. "I don't know yet," Lyra said. "That's the honest answer." Desh nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She left. Lyra sat on the edge of the guest bed and looked at her forearms in the lamplight. The marks were fully clear now, no longer fading between episodes. Permanent, or close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. She thought about Caden Weir in the northern mines. She thought about what it meant that she was here, in this room, with marks on her forearms that 300 dominant wolves were going to see tomorrow, and no clear accounting of how she had arrived at this exact point from the supply wagon and the 43 days and the borderlands that had been absorbed into a crown territory while she wasn't watching. She thought about what Kyle had said. There's no after for you in that scenario. She thought about what Darius had not said in response to it. The betrayal came from the direction she should have been watching, not Greaves, not directly. That was what she hadn't accounted for. She had been tracking Greaves because Kyle had named him, and Kyle was observant, and she trusted Kale's read of the room. She had been watching the door Greaves might come through, and she had not been watching the one that opened. It was Petra Solvang who came for her at the second hour past midnight, not with guards. That was the thing that made it work. Petra came alone, which was not the shape of a threat, which was why the door opened when the knock came. Petra Solvang, who had served 3 Alpha Kings, who ran the practical machinery of the realm with the efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, who had said to Darius in the private meeting room, "I've known you for 15 years, and you're managing something," and had been right. Petra, who Lyra had categorized as an obstacle to be careful around, but not a source of active danger because Petra's entire identity was built on maintaining the structure of the realm, and Lyra had assumed, wrongly, that maintaining the structure meant maintaining Darius. She hadn't thought it through far enough. Maintaining the structure meant maintaining the structure. Darius was inside the structure, not identical to it. If Darius had been compromised, and that was the word Petra would have used, compromised, spoken the way a woman who loves a machine speaks about a fault in one of its components, then maintaining the structure required removing the compromised element. "Come with me," Petra said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the meeting room, through the door, even practical, the voice of someone relaying a logistical fact. "The Alpha King would like to speak with you." "Where?" "The council chamber. He asked me to bring you directly." The council chamber was on the ground floor. She had never been in it, but she had cleaned the corridor outside it twice, and she knew its location. South wing, main level, accessible through the formal passage or through the service entrance that connected to the kitchen corridor on the east side. She followed Petra. She knew something was wrong on the third staircase. Not a specific thing, nothing she could have named at the time. A quality of the air, a quality of Petra's gait that was 2 degrees too deliberate. The particular way the lamp Petra carried threw its light slightly ahead of them, rather than around them. The body language of someone following a planned route rather than walking a familiar one. She had already gone wrong by the time she understood she'd gone wrong. The door at the bottom of the third staircase opened not onto the formal passage, but onto the east service corridor, the same corridor she had walked every day for 43 days. And standing in the east service corridor, with 4 guards she didn't recognize and Aldrich Greaves at their center, was the shape of the thing she should have seen coming. She stopped on the bottom stair. Petra stepped to the side. Not quickly, just a step. The movement of a woman creating space. Practical. Clean. "Lyra Vale," Greaves said. He was not performing anything. That was the most frightening version of him, she understood now. Not the contempt in the hall, not the cataloging inspection. This version, which was simply a man doing a job. "By order of the High Council of Alpha Lords, you are detained pending examination of the marks on your person and assessment of their nature and origin under the contested bloodline protocols." She had never heard of the contested bloodline protocols. She filed the fact that they existed, which meant they had been prepared, which meant someone had been planning for exactly this contingency for longer than the last 24 hours. "The Alpha King," she started. "The Alpha King has been informed of the Council's decision and has been asked to remove himself from involvement in this matter pending the examination." Greaves looked at her with the same even quality he'd had since the door opened. "This is a council action, not his." She looked at Petra. Petra met her eyes. There was nothing in Petra's face that was personal. That was the worst of it. Not malice, not fear, not even the calculation of a woman who had weighed her options and chosen the safer one. Just the pragmatism of someone who understood structures and had assessed that the structure required this. "You're a contested element in an unstable moment," Petra said. "The council isn't wrong to want examination. If what you carry is what some of them believe it is, the implications for governance are significant." "And if I go with him?" "The examination is formal, documented, protected under the council protocols." Petra's voice was entirely level. "This is the safer option." It was not the safer option. She understood that the moment Petra said it, safer was a word used by people who wanted you to stop calculating and start complying. And the protocol Greaves had named sounded official and documented and formal, and everything in the archive had told her what happened to sovereign bloodline carriers who were submitted to official examination by bodies controlled by Alpha Kings. The documentation was the trap. Once she was documented as a contested bloodline, she became a managed asset. A political question to be resolved by the people who controlled the resolution process. Caden Weir had known this. Keep yourself out of the system. Don't let them catalog you. She was already cataloged. She had been since intake day 43. The guards were at the bottom of the staircase. Greaves was 6 feet away. The East Service corridor was a dead end in the direction behind him. The door at the far end would be locked, she knew from 43 days of walking it. It was always locked after midnight. In the direction behind her was the third staircase, which went back to the north residential wing, which was surrounded. She was thinking very fast, and none of the thoughts were good. Greaves must have seen something in her face. He stepped forward. "Don't," he said. Not threatening. Advisory. "There is no version of this where you run that ends better than the version where you come with me." She looked at him. She thought about Kyle saying the wolves who can fight the recognition have already decided which side they're on. She thought about Greaves in the doorframe, hand white on the wood, knees that hadn't moved. "Who did you talk to tonight?" she said. "This isn't a negotiation." "I know. I'm asking because I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with." She looked at the guards behind him. Unfamiliar faces, not capital unit, not Carrick's rotation. "These aren't Ironmere guards." Greaves said nothing. "Whose pack?" she said. "Not yours. You run lean. 6 men is your preference." She looked at the guards more carefully. The insignia was covered. She could see the deliberate absence of it, the marks where patches had been removed recently. But the cut of the uniform, the color of the leather, Eastern, not Western, not Thornwall. "Essen," she said. "Coldfen territory. The Coldfen delegation that the Alpha King denied an audience." Greaves's face was entirely still. "You've been working with Margrave Essen," she said. "For how long?" "Come with us," Greaves said. The burning in her forearms had gone from background to foreground. Not pain, but pressure, like something building against a wall. She looked down at her arms. The marks were blazing through her sleeves, visible even through the fabric in the low corridor light, the geometric lines sharp and bright and completely beyond her ability to suppress. One of the Coldfen guards saw it. She watched him react. The instinctive thing, the recognition trying to fire in the old blood, his body understanding before his mind did. He took a half step backward. The guard beside him felt it through proximity and shifted. Greaves felt it too. She could see it in his jaw, in the specific quality of effort it cost him. He was stronger against it than the Coldfen guards, or he had something invested enough in resisting that it gave him leverage against the instinct. "I said come," Greaves said. His voice had an edge in it now. Not anger, something more structural than anger. Necessity. He crossed the remaining space between them and closed his hand on her upper arm. Contact made it worse. She felt it the moment he touched her. Felt his own system react to the contact, the recognition spiking through his grip even as he fought it, and felt something in herself respond to the contact that she had not felt before. Not just the burning. Something that used the burning as fuel. Something that moved up from her forearms into her chest and her throat and her eyes and wanted to open. She held it. She held it because she didn't know what it would do if she let it, and she was in a corridor with 6 guards and Petra Solvang and a man who was taking her to Margrave Essen of Coldfen territory, and whatever the awakening was, this was not the moment for it. "Don't fight it," Greaves said, his voice pulled tight. "I can do this without hurting you. I would prefer to." She let him move her toward the guards. She kept the burning locked down inside her forearms, and she let him move her because she was doing what she had always done in the moments that mattered. Calculating. Moving the pieces. Counting what she had and what she didn't, and what the next 48 hours required of her. She had the marks. She had the archive text, all of it, inside her head now, as clear and accessible as if she had spent years studying it. She had Kael, somewhere in this building, who had felt the recognition and gone to one knee and made a choice. She had Desh, who noticed everything and asked the right questions and had survived the capital system since she was 9 years old. She did not have Darius, who had been informed of the council's decision and asked to remove himself from involvement. She turned that over as Greaves walked her down the service corridor, feeling the shape of it. Informed, asked, not ordered. The Alpha King of the werewolf realm, asked by his council to step aside. He had either agreed, or he had not agreed and they had moved without him. She didn't know which was worse. The door at the far end of the corridor opened, unlocked after all from the outside, by a figure who stepped through it into the corridor lamplight and stopped when he saw what was in front of him. Desh. 16 years old, capital-born, no pack, a bundle of clean towels in both hands from a late laundry rotation, staring at Lyra in Greaves' grip, and the Coldfen guards and Petra Solvang standing to the side of all of it. Lyra looked at her. 1 second. 2. Go, she said, low and flat and completely clear. Desh looked at the guards. She looked at Greaves. She looked at Lyra's face and at the blazing marks that were visible even through her sleeves and at the clean towels in her own hands, which were shaking. She turned and ran. Greaves swore. One of the Coldfen guards moved to follow. Let her go, Greaves said. Not generosity. Calculation. A 16-year-old kitchen worker running through the building at this hour was not a threat he needed to manage. Stopping her would cost more than ignoring her. He kept moving Lyra forward. She let him. She kept the burning locked inside. She kept her face neutral and her breathing even, and she counted the steps to the door at the far end of the corridor, and she counted the guards, and she thought about Kael in the East residential wing, and whether Desh was fast enough, and whether fast enough mattered. And underneath all of it, underneath the counting and the calculating and the careful management of everything she had, she felt something shift. Not the marks, not the recognition, something deeper than both. Something she had been holding shut since the archive, since the dream, since the figure in the dream had said, you're running out of time to decide who you're going to be before someone else decides for you. Someone else was deciding for her. Right now. In this corridor. Greaves walked her through the door. It closed behind them. And in the dark behind her eyes, in the place where the burning lived, something that had been pressing against a wall for 11 days stopped pressing and simply started moving. Quiet, inexorable, and completely beyond her ability to stop even if she had wanted to. She did not want to. They took her to the South Wing holding room, which was not a cell but functioned as one. A ground-floor chamber used for detained delegates during formal disputes, furnished with the minimal dignity the council protocols required, which meant a chair and a lamp and a door that locked from the outside with 2 bolts. Greaves locked both. She heard his boots recede down the corridor and then silence, the specific silence of a building continuing its operations around a point of stillness. Somewhere above her the gathering was still running. She could feel it in the stone, that low-layered pressure of 300 dominant wolves in structured proximity. It was past midnight, but the formal sessions ran until the business was finished, not until anyone was tired. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. The thing that had started moving in the corridor was still moving. She could feel it the way you feel a river under ice, the surface holding, for now, but the pressure building against it from below. She had locked it down because the corridor had been the wrong place, the wrong moment, 6 guards and a closed door and no line of sight to anything that mattered. She needed to think before she let it move. She sat in the chair and looked at her forearms in the lamplight. The marks were blazing, brighter than they had ever been. The geometric lines so clear they looked carved. She pressed her thumbs against them and felt the pulse under her skin. Not her heartbeat, something with a different rhythm, something older. She thought about the archive text, the word that meant authority without a clean translation. The way the text had described the awakening not as a moment but as a sequence, each stage building on the last, and the final stage described in language she had read carefully and read again because the language was precise in the old dialect, in a way that didn't survive translation into anything modern. The modern approximation was something like, the full sovereign state is achieved not through the individual's choice alone, but through the moment when the weight of institutional injustice becomes structurally unsupportable. She had not fully understood what that meant when she read it. She was beginning to understand it now. Scan. Desh ran. She was not fast in the way trained wolves were fast. Not the burst speed of an alpha-ranked male in pursuit, not the endurance of a pack runner on open ground. She was fast in the way a girl who had survived the capital system since she was 9 years old was fast, which meant she knew every corridor, every staircase, every service passage and maintenance hatch and linen closet, and alternate route in this building the way she knew her own breathing. She went up the east staircase through the third-floor residential corridor and hammered on the door of the room Evander Kale of Valehurst had been assigned, without slowing down enough to think about whether hammering on a foreign Alpha Lord's door at midnight was something she was allowed to do. The door opened in under 10 seconds. Kael was not asleep. He was dressed, standing with the particular alertness of someone who had been expecting something to happen and had been waiting to find out what shape it arrived in. He looked at Desh, at her face, at the shaking in her hands, and he said, "Where?" "East Service Corridor, ground floor. Greaves had 6 men, Coldfen insignia under covered patches. She was breathing hard. They took her south." Kyle was already moving. He looked back into his room and said one word to his guards, and then came into the corridor and looked at Desh. "The Alpha King. Where is he?" "I don't know." "Who would know?" "Petra Solvang was in the corridor with Greaves. She—" Desh stopped, swallowed. "She was with them." Kael looked at her for exactly 1 second. She watched him recalibrate, watched him take in the full implication of Petra Solvang standing in a corridor with Aldrich Greaves and 6 Coldfen guards and file it in the correct slot without flinching, because Kael was a man who had survived 12 years of deliberate distance from the Ironmere court by understanding faster than his opponents. "Find the king," he said to Desh, "not through official channels, not through guard command, directly. You understand me? He'll be in the North Residential Wing or the Private Council. Then go to both." He was already moving down the corridor. "Now." Maracked. Darius was in neither location. He was in the archive. He had gone there 2 hours after Petra had left his private council room with the specific flatness of a woman who had made a decision and was done discussing it. He had gone there because the archive was the only place in this building that he trusted the walls of, and because he needed to read the final section of the volume again, the section he had skimmed 7 years ago and not returned to, because it described a sequence of events that he had categorized as mythology rather than operational planning, and he needed to revisit that categorization with the particular attention of a man who understood he had made an error. The error was not Petra. He should have anticipated Petra. He had known, in the abstract, that her primary loyalty was to the structure rather than to him personally. He had always known that and had considered it a feature, not a weakness, because a woman whose loyalty was to the structure rather than to the man was reliable in a way that personal loyalty never was. What he had not fully accounted for was what the structure looked like from Petra's vantage point when a sovereign bloodline entered it. To Petra, the structure was the realm's governance, the council, the protocols, the formal mechanisms of Alpha King authority. And a sovereign bloodline, according to everything the suppressed histories described, did not work within those mechanisms. It preceded them. It superseded them. It did not require their permission. That was not something the structure could absorb. So the structure, through Petra, had moved to contain it. Through the most legally defensible mechanism available, the contested bloodline protocols, which were documented and formal and had been on the books for 300 years, installed by an Alpha King who had faced a similar situation and had handled it in a way that the official histories described as adjudication and that the suppressed archive described in considerably different terms. He was reading those different terms when he heard boots on the archive stairs. He came to his feet with his hand on the blade at his hip before he identified the weight of the footstep. Not a guard, not Greaves, too light and too fast. The door at the bottom of the stairs opened, and Desh came through it at a run and stopped when she saw him, both hands braced on the doorframe, her chest heaving. He stared at her. "How did you know this room existed?" "I've cleaned this corridor for 2 years. I know every door in this building." She was pulling breath back. They took her. Greaves. 6 Coldfen guards. Petra was there. A pause. They went south. He was already past her on the stairs. The South Wing corridor was 40 seconds from the archive at the pace he moved, which was not the pace of a man trying to look like he was in control of the situation. He was not in control of the situation. He had understood that from the moment Petra had left his rooms with that specific flatness in her expression, and he had spent 2 hours in the archive trying to determine if there was a version of this that could still be managed without blowing the structure apart. And he had concluded, 40 pages into the suppressed histories, that there was not. Some things could not be managed. They could only be met. Carrick was in the south corridor with 2 of his unit, which meant someone had positioned them here. Not a standard circuit, a specific placement. Carrick looked at Darius coming down the corridor at that pace, and his face did the thing the faces of men do when their direct superior is moving faster than the situation they were told to expect. "My lord, open it." The council protocols require Carrick. He stopped in front of the door. "I am the Alpha King of this realm. The council advises me. It does not supersede me. Open the door or move out of my way." Carrick looked at him for a moment. 3 years of service, 12 years of the fear infrastructure, the reputation, the weight of 11 years of the kind of governance that made men certain of consequences. Carrick made the calculation that every wolf in proximity to Darius eventually made and stepped aside. Darius pulled the bolts himself. She was standing in the center of the room when the door opened. Not sitting, standing, spine straight, arms at her sides, forearms blazing through her sleeves in the lamplight. She looked at him when the door opened, and something in her face did not relax. It clarified, which was different, the look of someone who had been running calculations for the last 40 minutes and had just received a new data point. "How long?" he said. 40 minutes, approximately." "Did they touch you?" "Greaves held my arm in the corridor." He looked at her forearms. The marks were at a brightness level he hadn't seen before. Past the baseline, past the escalation he'd witnessed in the archive, and the service corridor, something had moved. He could feel it in the room the way you feel a pressure change before a storm, that specific alteration of the air. "We need to move," he said. "Where?" "The main hall." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Greaves and Essen are going to move their play before morning, and they're going to move it in front of the full gathering because that's where the legitimacy is. If they can present you as a contested bloodline under formal council examination in front of 300 pack leaders, the resolution becomes a consensus action rather than a unilateral one." He held the door. "I'm not going to let them pick the ground." She walked through the door. Carrick was in the corridor. He looked at Lyra and the blazing marks, and his face did the thing. The involuntary response, the old blood recognition, the body understanding before the mind. He didn't kneel, but he didn't move to stop her. "Carrick," Darius said, "find KL. Tell him the main hall. Tell him now." Carrick moved. Quote, Kale was already in the main corridor when they came through the north entrance of the hall, 3 of his Valehurst guards at his back. He took one look at Lyra's forearms and then at Darius and said, "Essen's been moving since midnight. He's pulled 6 of the mid-tier pack leaders into a private session. I don't know the room." "I know the room," Darius said. "Southeast private chamber. It's the one with the external bolt, which means they can lock it from the inside. They're waiting for a signal." "Greaves," Lyra said. "Greaves," Darius confirmed. "He needs to present the formal detention to the full council before they can invoke the protocols. That means he needs the hall in session." "So we need to be in the hall first," Kael said. "We need to be in the hall when they get there." They moved. The main hall at this hour was not empty. It was never fully empty during gathering, the formal sessions ending but the political circulation continuing, wolves in small groups conducting the side negotiations that didn't make the official record. Lyra counted, as they came through the main entrance, perhaps 60 wolves in the space. Not the full 300. Enough. Darius walked to the center of the floor and stopped. He did not announce himself. He did not have to. The Alpha King of the realm, walking into the main hall at 2 hours past midnight with Evander Kyle of Valehurst at his left and a woman with blazing marks on both forearms at his right, produced its own announcement, the specific attention of a room reorganizing itself toward a point of significance before anyone had consciously decided to look. Wolves turned. Conversation stopped. The 60 became an audience. Lyra stood on the main floor of the autumn gathering and felt the weight of 60 dominant wolves' attention and felt what she had been holding down in the corridor and in the holding room push against the wall with a force she was running out of capacity to resist. Not yet, she told it. Hold. Greaves came through the south entrance 4 minutes later. He came with the 6 Coldfen guards and 2 of the senior council members. Aldrich Greaves moving with the specific controlled pace of a man who had committed to a course of action and was now executing it, whatever the cost. He saw Darius in the center of the floor, and he stopped. The room saw them both stop. Lord Alpha. Greaves' voice was even, addressed to the room as much as to Darius, performing for the audience that had assembled, establishing the formal register. The Council has invoked the contested bloodline protocols regarding the individual known as Lyra Vale. This is a documented Council action under established governance law. I'm aware of what it is, Darius said. Then you're aware that the protocols require the Alpha King's non-involvement pending formal examination. I'm aware that the protocols were written by Alpha King Corvus III in the 31st year of his reign, following the detention and subsequent death of a bloodline carrier who was later determined by council review to have posed no threat to the realm. His voice was carrying now, reaching the full space, every wolf in the hall picking it up. I'm also aware that the review was conducted after the death, and the finding was therefore academic. Greaves held his ground. The law is the law. The law is what I say it is. Flat, complete. 11 years of infrastructure behind it. That's what makes it my law. Something moved in the room, not physically, but a collective recalibration, 60 wolves running the math of what they were witnessing. Darius against the formal council mechanism. The Alpha King choosing the individual over the institutional procedure. The thing that never happened in the structure Petra had spent 15 years maintaining. You're compromised, Greaves said. He said it directly, without the performance register now, speaking to the room. This council has the right, under charter, to invoke review of an Alpha King's judgment when a contested element has been introduced into his proximity. We are invoking that right. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before a structure breaks. Darius looked at Greaves. He had known this man for 6 years, had trusted him in the particular way you trust a tool, had believed that their interests were aligned enough for the alignment to hold. He looked at Greaves' face now, and saw the thing Cale had seen in the doorframe, the decision already made, the commitment already spent. There was nothing left to manage here, no window, no 48 hours. You've been working with Essen for how long? Darius said. This isn't how long. Greaves' jaw tightened. 3 years. The room reacted, softly, not the way it would react with full 300 present, but audibly, the 60 wolves absorbing 3 years and everything it implied about what decisions had been made in those 3 years and what information had moved through Greaves' position in that time. And Petra? Darius said. Petra understands governance, Greaves said. She understands that a realm doesn't survive the introduction of an uncontrollable element, not even a realm as stable as this one. He looked at Lyra, then back at Darius. This isn't about Essen's territorial ambitions. This is about what happens to everything you've built in the last 11 years when that woman's power awakens fully in a room with 300 alpha wolves. You cannot control it. You cannot predict it. You cannot govern a realm around a force you don't understand. The argument was not stupid. Lyra heard it for what it was. Not personal malice, not simple ambition, but the logic of a man who had looked at something he couldn't categorize and had concluded that removal was the only safe response. The same logic that 7 centuries of Alpha Kings had used. The same logic that had produced 300 years of suppression and burned archives and contested bloodline protocols with built-in outcomes. Greaves was not wrong about what he didn't understand. He was wrong about what to do about it. I can answer that, she said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Darius looked at her. She could see him making the calculation. Whether to let her speak, what it cost, what it might produce. She held his gaze for 1 second, and he made the decision she needed him to make and said nothing. She looked at Greaves. You can't control what you don't understand, she said. That's the argument. 3 centuries of Alpha Kings used the same one. They were right that they couldn't control it. They were wrong about what that meant. She looked around the room, the 60 wolves, the faces doing various versions of the calculation Greaves had done, and arriving at different places with it. Sovereign authority isn't a weapon. It isn't a competing power structure. It's what exists when the structure underneath collapses under its own weight. She looked at Greaves steadily. You've been working against the Alpha King for 3 years. You've been feeding Essen information for 3 years. The structure held anyway because the fear held. But the fear has a load limit, and this realm hit it before I walked through the gate. And what you're looking at right now isn't me causing that. It's me arriving after it was already done. The room was very quiet. Greaves said, "Take her." The 6 Coldfen guards moved, and the thing that had been pressing against the wall since the corridor, the thing she had held down through the holding room and the corridor and the last 40 minutes of the hall, stopped responding to her. It moved. Not violence. Nothing that she chose or aimed. Something that came from below the level of choice, the way the kneeling had come from below the level of choice in the Valehurst guards. She felt it move through her from the marks outward, through her arms and her chest and her eyes, and the light in the hall changed. Not the lamps, not the torches. Something that came from her skin, the marks blazing at a level that was no longer subtle, no longer faint, no longer deniable to anyone present. The first Coldfen guard stopped. The second went to one knee. The third and fourth stopped walking at the same moment, their bodies understanding something their minds hadn't caught up to yet. Greaves pushed through them. He was the strongest fighter in the room after Darius. She knew that now. And he had the particular ruthlessness of a man who had already spent 3 years deciding where his loyalty was and had nothing left to lose to indecision. He crossed the floor toward her with his hand on the hilt of his blade. And Darius moved. Not toward her, between them. He crossed the distance between himself and Greaves in 3 strides, and the thing that happened next was not political and not performed. It was 2 men, one of whom had been building toward this moment for 3 years, and one of whom had been governing around it for 11, meeting in the center of a hall with 60 witnesses. Darius caught Greaves' blade hand at the wrist, wrenched, drove his elbow into the joint with the specific precision of someone who had learned where things break. The blade hit the stone floor. Greaves took the hit and came back with his other hand. An open strike at the throat that Darius turned away from, barely, the edge of it catching his jaw, blood at the corner of his mouth. They went to the floor together. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of combat that got commemorated. It was 2 large wolves in close quarters with the full weight of everything they'd built and everything they'd destroyed between them, and it was brutal and quick and ended when Darius got Greaves face down on the stone with one arm behind his back at an angle that communicated with physical specificity exactly what would happen if Greaves kept moving. Greaves stopped moving. The hall was absolutely silent. Darius's breathing was hard. There was blood on his chin and a cut along his jaw that was going to need attention, and he held Greaves on the stone floor and looked up at the room with the face of a man who has just done something in front of 60 witnesses that he cannot take back. The Alpha King, blood on his face, his chief lord face down beneath him, in the main hall of the autumn gathering. No infrastructure. No performance. Just the man underneath it, holding something down that had cost him to hold. He looked at Lyra. She was standing in the center of the hall with the marks blazing on both forearms, and the light that wasn't lamplight still present in the space around her. And outside in the corridors, she could hear it now. The sound of the rest of the gathering, becoming aware that something was happening. Boots moving, voices. The building's pressure shifting. The other 240 wolves were coming. Cale appeared at her left side. He looked at Greaves on the floor, and at Darius, and at the 2 Coldfen guards still on their knees, and then at her, and he said very quietly, "Whatever you're holding, don't hold it much longer." The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Pack leaders, 40, 60, more, filling the entry and spreading into the space, the full weight of the gathering arriving in real time, drawn by instinct and noise, and the particular frequency that she had stopped trying to suppress an hour ago. They came into the hall and they saw what was in it. Darius on the floor, with Greaves beneath him, blood on his face, and Lyra in the center with the marks blazing. And the room did the thing rooms do when a truth arrives in them faster than the narrative prepared to explain it. It went still, not silent, still. 300 dominant wolves holding position the way a body holds position when the brain is trying to catch up to the data. Lyra looked at the room. She felt the weight of it. 300 pairs of eyes, 300 old bloodlines, 300 generations of dominance hierarchy pointing at her like a compass needle at north. She felt Darius looking at her from the floor. She felt Kyle at her left, steady and waiting. She felt the archive text in her head. Every word, the old dialect perfectly clear, and the final section that described this exact moment in language that had taken her 3 readings to understand. The Sovereign does not claim the room. The room recognizes what it has always already known. She looked at the assembled pack leaders of the werewolf realm. She opened her mouth, and from the back of the hall, Margrave Essen of Coldfin stepped through the door with 20 armed wolves at his back and a formal council decree in his hand and said, in a voice designed to carry, by order of the Provisional Governing Council, both the Alpha King and the contested bloodline subject are hereby under formal detention pending emergency governance review. 20 armed wolves into a hall of 300, a provisional council that did not exist an hour ago. And Lyra Vale standing in the center of the floor, with the marks blazing and 300 wolves caught between what they'd just felt and what the man in the doorway was telling them they were supposed to do about it, understanding with total clarity that the next 30 seconds were going to determine what kind of realm this was, and what kind of woman she was going to have to be inside it. She met Darius's eyes across the floor. He was still holding Greaves. His jaw was bleeding. His face had nothing managed in it, nothing performed, nothing left over from 11 years of infrastructure. He looked like a man waiting to see what was possible. She turned to face Essen, and she let go of the wall entirely. The light came out of her like breath. Not an explosion. Nothing that dramatic. Nothing that required a word as violent as that. It was more like a dam recognizing that the river had already won and simply stepping aside. The marks on her forearms stopped blazing and started radiating, the geometric lines spreading light the way a coal spreads heat, outward and steady and completely without malice, and she stood in the center of the main hall of the autumn gathering and let it go. The room responded the way the archive text said it would. Not all at once. The old blood first. The wolves whose genetics ran deepest, whose lines carried the most of the original nature, who had been feeling the pull for days without language for it. They went down like trees in a silent wind, 1 and then 2 and then a cascade. Dominant wolves with decades of authority behind them, folding at the knee without deciding to. Their bodies completing an action that some part of them had been moving toward since she walked through the Capitol gate 43 days ago. Evander Kale was already on one knee at her left. He had not stood back up since the service corridor. The 20 armed wolves Essen had brought through the door stopped walking. Not all of them knelt. Several of them were young blood, low lineage, the recognition too faint to override training and direct order. But they stopped. And in stopping, lost the momentum Essen needed. Essen himself did not kneel. He was standing in the doorway with the formal decree in his hand and 20 wolves who had just stopped moving. And she watched him make the calculation in real time. The decree, the Provisional Council, the 3 years of positioning with Greaves, the territorial ambitions that had been the engine of all of it, and now a hall full of pack leaders doing something his plan had not accounted for. "This is manipulation," Essen said. His voice was carrying, but it had lost the certainty it had when he walked in. He was speaking to the room, to the pack leaders who had not knelt, to the undecided wolves calculating their position. Bloodline coercion. This is exactly what the protocols exist to prevent: a contested element using instinctive compulsion to override the legitimate governance. "Look at your own men," Kyle said from the floor. Flat, even. 3 of them are on their knees, Essen. They didn't choose that. You think that's coercion? I think it's exactly what we were warned about. You were warned about it by the people who wanted to suppress it, Kale said. That's not the same as being warned about what it actually is. Lyra was not listening to the argument. She was looking at the room, at the pack leaders, at the faces running their calculations, at the specific quality of attention 300 wolves were paying to the light coming off her forearms and what it was doing to the wolves around her. She was looking for something. She found it near the east entrance, a cluster of mid-tier pack leaders from the border territories. Border wolves, the same category she had come from, standing together with the particular stillness of people who have been told for a long time that their stillness is the appropriate response to everything and are currently experiencing something that is making them question that. She looked at Essen. "Put it down," she said. He stared at her. "The decree." She looked at the paper in his hand. "Put it down. Not because I'm telling you to, because it was built on a premise that isn't true anymore, and you know it, and holding it up in this room right now is just a way of avoiding what you actually have to decide." The room was listening, all of it. She could feel the attention the way you feel pressure against your skin. Essen said, "You have no standing to—" "I'm standing in the main hall of the autumn gathering with the marks of the sovereign bloodline fully activated and 300 pack leaders as witnesses." Her voice was not loud. She didn't need loud. "That's my standing. Now put it down." Essen's jaw tightened. The decree stayed in his hand, but his arm had dropped slightly. She watched him look at the room, at the knelt wolves, at Greaves still face down on the stone, at Darius who had risen to his feet and was standing with blood on his jaw and his hand at his side and his face containing everything he had spent 11 years not letting anyone see. Essen put the decree down, not on a table. He let it fall. It hit the stone floor and lay there, all the legal architecture, all 3 years of positioning, all the formal language of a provisional council that had never convened, face down on the granite of a hall that had just watched it become irrelevant. The room breathed. What followed was not simple. Nothing that happened in the next 6 hours was simple, and she would not remember it as simple. She would remember it as the hardest sustained work of her life, harder than 43 days of kitchen shifts, harder than the holding room, harder than standing in the corridor with Greaves' hand on her arm. Because power arriving was one thing. Power being exercised responsibly in a room full of frightened, recalibrating dominant wolves while still bleeding from the inside. From everything the last 5 days had cost was something else entirely. She called a formal session. Not Darius, her. She stood in the center of the hall, and she called a session of the full gathering, and the pack leaders assembled because the pull in the room gave them no framework for doing otherwise. And she stood before them and said what she had understood in the archive in the cold basement light. She said that the sovereign bloodline was not a throne. She had not come to rule them. She said that what she carried was closer to an accountability, a biological mechanism that the early wolf lines had carried before the Alpha King structure existed, designed not to govern, but to register when governance had broken down past a critical point. A canary, she said, and some of them understood the reference and some didn't, and the ones who didn't understood what she meant anyway. A signal. The awakening happened when the load became unsupportable. She said that she was not their answer. She was evidence of their question. She watched them process that. She watched it land differently in different wolves, the old blood, who felt it in their bones and understood it immediately. The political wolves, who were calculating what it meant for their position. The border pack leaders near the east entrance, who were very still and very attentive in the way of people who have been waiting a long time for permission to name something they already knew. She talked for a long time. She did not have notes. She had the archive, perfect and complete in her memory, and she had 43 days and Caden Weir's locked chest and second-hand boots and a bruise on her shoulder blade that was still green-yellow at the edges, and she used all of it. Darius did not speak during the session. He stood at the edge of the main floor with his jaw bleeding and his face open in a way that she understood cost him something significant, and he let her speak without interruption, without qualification, without the infrastructure. She noticed that. She would keep noticing it later. When the formal session ended just before dawn, and the pack leaders dispersed into exhausted clusters to absorb what had happened, he crossed the hall floor to where she was standing. He stopped 3 feet away. Close enough for the conversation to be private, far enough to make it a choice. He looked at her forearms. The marks were still present, fully embedded now, permanent. But the light had quieted to the baseline. She was tired in a way that had gone past physical and become structural, the kind of tired that required more than sleep to address. "You didn't claim the throne," he said. "There is no throne in the sovereign framework. That's the point. Every wolf in that room expected you to." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The hall was emptying around them, the 60 and then the 300 slowly diffusing back into the building's corridors. Kyle was near the south entrance talking to two of the border pack leaders. Greaves was in formal custody, which Carrick had handled with the specific efficiency of a man relieved to have a clear directive. Essen had left the hall with the particular gait of a man calculating his next move and coming up short. "Petra," Darius said. "She was protecting what she understood," Lyra said. "The structure, as she knew it. She wasn't wrong about the structure needing protection." She looked at him. She was wrong about what was threatening it. "I'll need to address her role formally." "Oh, yes, but not tonight." He looked at her. Something in his face was working through a sequence she recognized. Not the managed stillness, not the performance. A man doing the actual accounting. What had been spent? What remained? What the difference was between them and whether anything could be built on it. "You said tonight that the sovereign bloodline is a signal," he said. "A marker that the load became unsupportable, that the structure failed." "Yes, that structure was mine." She held his gaze. "Yes." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it without flinching, which told her more about what he was actually made of than any of the 11 years of infrastructure had told her. The men who could take a true accounting were rare. In her experience, they were rarer than the ones who were brave. "What happens now?" he said. Not to her specifically, to the air between them, which was the question's actual destination. "Now we find out whether a realm that was held together by fear can be rebuilt around something that lasts longer." She paused. "That's not a small project." "No. It's going to require every pack leader in that room to accept a governance model they've never operated under. It's going to require border protocols that don't function on absorptions and levy threats. It's going to require an accounting of what the labor camps have cost the families who've been feeding them." She looked at him steadily. "It's going to require you to govern differently than you have. Not because I'm telling you to, because the only way this works is if the change is real and the room can feel that it's real." He was quiet long enough that the silence had weight in it. Then, "I know." 2 words. She believed them. Not because she trusted him yet. Trust was an architecture that required time and evidence, and they had 43 days and one catastrophic 5-day sequence and approximately nothing else. But she believed that he understood what he was saying, and that was a foundation different from all the other foundations she'd been offered, which had mostly been ones that required her to pretend to believe things she didn't. "Caden Weir," she said, "the Northern Mines. I'll send for him. Today." "Today," he said, without hesitation. She nodded. "Tin." The sun came up over Ironmere while the gathering was still in its aftermath, the building buzzing with the particular energy of a world that has just reorganized itself and hasn't yet settled into the new shape. Lyra was standing on the outer steps of the main hall in the early light when Desh found her. The girl looked exhausted and wired in equal measure, the specific condition of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and is beginning to register that the adrenaline has a bottom. She came and stood beside Lyra on the steps and looked out at the courtyard, where early rising members of the Capitol staff were beginning their morning routines with the careful obliviousness of people who have learned that not noticing is a survival strategy. "You okay?" Desh said. Lyra thought about that question. She had been thinking about a version of it since the archive. Since the figure in the dream had said, "Decide who you're going to be before someone else decides for you," and she had spent 5 days living out the practical answer. She was not okay in the sense of uninjured. She was not okay in the sense of done. What she was, she thought, was present, fully and irreversibly in the life she was actually living, which was a different thing from okay, but was possibly more important. "Getting there," she said. Desh was quiet for a moment, then, "What happens to people like me? In the new system, whatever you're building?" Lyra looked at her. Kitchen ranked, capital born, no pack. 9 years old when the structure had absorbed her family and reclassified her and filed her in the welfare allocation and moved on. A girl who had survived by knowing every corridor and every door and every alternate route, and who had run through this building at midnight to find a man she had never directly addressed before because Lyra had said, "Go." "People like you," Lyra said, "are the reason the new system needs to exist." Desh looked at her. "You've been running this capital's actual operation since you were 9 years old," Lyra said. "You and Senna and everyone else in that dormitory. The wolves this structure was built to serve, the pack leaders in the hall, the lords in their positions and their territorial claims. None of it functions without the people it pretends aren't there." She looked back at the courtyard. "That's going to change." Desh was quiet for a long moment. The courtyard was filling slowly with morning light, the amber stone warming. A cart was moving along the far wall, carrying something that needed to be somewhere else, pushed by a man who was going to push carts until someone changed the conditions that made cart pushing his entire horizon. "Okay," Desh said finally. "Not a question, an agreement." Greaves was formally stripped of his position 3 days after the gathering concluded, in a session that Lyra did not attend because her attendance would have made it about her, and it needed to be about the governance record, the 3 years of information passed to Essen, the territorial maneuvering, the contested bloodline protocols invoked under false council authority. The session was documented. The stripping was legitimate. He was not executed. She had made that clear, not as a directive, but as a position, stated once in Kael's presence and Darius's hearing and left there to be considered. Execution for political betrayal was the logic of the old system, the one that ran on fear, that understood power as something you defended by removing threats. She was not interested in building the new thing on that foundation. Greaves went to house confinement in the Western Territory. She did not know what he did with the time. She suspected he used it to understand things he had previously been too certain to consider. Essen's case was more complicated because Essen had not technically violated any existing law. The Cold Fen territorial ambitions were politically opportunistic, not criminal, and the alliance with Greaves existed in a gray area that the current governance framework had no clean language for. That became one of the first projects of the new council, a council that was not the Alpha Lords alone, that had regional representation from the border pacts for the first time in the realm's recorded history, that included 2 members who had come from welfare allocation intake and knew what the bottom of the structure looked like from inside it. Desh was not on the council. She was 60. But she was in the room where the council met, in an administrative capacity that Lyra had created specifically because someone needed to be in that room who had spent years understanding how the capital actually operated. And Desh was the most qualified person for that work. Caden Weir arrived at Ironmere 6 weeks after the gathering ended. He was thinner than she remembered. The northern mines left marks that were slower to heal than the visible kind, a particular quality of stillness in his movements, a slight hesitation before certain sounds, the way he sat with his back to a wall when there was a wall to put his back to. She understood those things without needing them explained. She had her own marks, differently shaped. He stood in the courtyard outside the main hall and looked at the marks on her forearms for a long moment. The morning light made them clear, geometric, permanent, softly luminous even in the daylight. "You opened the chest," he said. "The chest was in Ashfin. I only opened the archive." He looked at her. 43 days. 43 days. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him make the same accounting she had watched Darius make. The difference between what had been spent and what remained, and whether anything could be built on it. Caden Weir was better at the accounting than most. He had always been better at it. "The settlement," he said, "we're working on the reclassification framework. Border absorptions under the old protocols are being reviewed. The people from Ashfin who want to reconstitute a community have the legal standing to petition." She paused. "It won't give back what was taken. Nothing does." "No," he said, "but it matters that someone knows that." The night before the formal dissolution of the Autumn Gathering's emergency governance period, Lyra stood on the outer wall of the Sovereign Citadel, an ancient structure at the capital's northern edge that had been sealed for 2 centuries and reopened at her request, because the archive text had described it as the original seat of sovereign authority, and she wanted to understand what she was working with. The citadel was not grand. That was the thing that struck her standing in it. It was not built for spectacle. The chambers were functional, the walls undecorated, the stone chosen for durability rather than beauty. It had been built by people who understood that the work was the point, and the architecture served the work, not the other way around. She was looking out over the capital when she heard him on the stairs. Darius came to stand beside her. He was without guards, had been, increasingly, operating without the full security apparatus, which was either evidence of trust or evidence of a man trying to understand what he was without the infrastructure and finding the experiment uncomfortable and doing it anyway. She suspected the latter, which she respected more than the former would have merited. He looked out over the city. "It's different from up here," he said. "Everything looks different when you change your elevation." He was quiet for a moment. The night was clear and cold, the stars dense overhead, the city lit below them with the specific warm scatter of 1,000 individual fires, people going about the business of being alive, in all the directions that required. "I spent 11 years governing from fear," he said. "Not because I thought it was right, because I didn't see another way to hold it together." He looked out at the city. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not. I need to say it anyway. Not to you specifically. I just need to say it in the air where it's real." He paused. "I made decisions that put people in mines, that absorbed settlements, that let men like Greaves build positions because they were useful and I didn't examine what they were building those positions for." He stopped. She waited. "I don't know how to undo that," he said. "I know how to do the work going forward. I don't know how to make the accounting come out even." "It doesn't come out even," she said. "That's not how it works." She looked out at the fires below. "You do the work going forward and you carry the accounting. Both. The carrying is part of the work." He looked at her. "That's not forgiveness," she said. "I can't give you that. I don't have that authority for the people whose settlements were absorbed or whose families are in the mines or who spent years in a structure that treated them as logistics problems." She looked at him steadily. "What I can tell you is that I watched you choose 4 days ago in a corridor with blood on your face and a man you'd trusted for 6 years on the floor, and you chose forward. And I watched you stand in a hall and let someone else speak and mean it." She paused. "That's what I have. That's what I can work with." He held her gaze. "It's not enough." "No," she said, "but it's real, and real is what we build from." The city burned warm below them. The cold air moved across the wall of the citadel. Somewhere in the building behind them, the new council was still in session, Kael's voice audible in the low registers. The specific tone of men and women working through a problem that didn't have a clean answer but needed an answer anyway. Darius looked out at the realm he had governed for 11 years and was about to govern differently, with the full weight of what differently would cost, and she watched him choose that weight rather than put it down. She thought it was the most honest thing she had seen him do, including all the moments of honesty she had witnessed at significant cost to both of them. She turned back to the city. The marks on her forearms held their light against the dark, steady, geometric, entirely present. Not blazing, not suppressed, just there, the way a true thing is just there once it has been named, permanent, clear, and no longer requiring anyone's permission to exist. The age of the Alpha Kings had not ended in a single night. That was not how structures ended, not the ones that had been running for 7 centuries. They ended in the slow, unglamorous work of council sessions and reclassification frameworks, and a 16-year-old girl in an administrative capacity, and a man learning to govern without the infrastructure of fear, one decision at a time, each one slightly more honest than the last. Lyra Vale understood this the way she understood the archive, completely, and without the comfort of it being simple. She understood it, and she stayed. She stayed because the work required someone who had seen the bottom of the structure and the top of it, and everything in between, who had 43 days of kitchen shifts and a bruised shoulder blade and second-hand boots, and the old tongue sitting perfect and complete in her memory. Who had been invisible and been found and had chosen, when the choosing mattered, to be neither invisible nor simply found, but something the language hadn't quite made a word for yet. The night held. Below them, the city held. The realm, imperfect and damaged, and beginning the long work of something better, held. And standing on the wall of the ancient citadel in the clear, cold dark, Lyra Vale, last of the sovereign blood, former kitchen worker, 43 days in and permanently changed, held too. Not because she had to, because she had decided to. That was the only kind of holding that lasted.